Well, welcome everyone. It is so great to have you here today. Thank you for tuning in. We're going to get started. And so thanks also for introducing yourselves in the chat. We're going to take a minute now to introduce the team presenting this webinar. So my name is Katie Blake, and I'm a conservationist at Highstead, a small environmental nonprofit in Redding, Connecticut. I'm also the co-coordinator of the Northeast Bird Habitat Conservation Initiative, and I'm joined by my co-facilitator and facilitators and co-coordinator of the initiative, Sarah Barker, and our GIS expert, Brian Hall. Sarah, want to introduce yourself?
Good morning, everyone. I'm Sarah Barker. I work for the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, and I'm also the director of the Cornell Land Trust Bird Conservation Initiative. And as Katie said, I'm the co-coordinator with her of the Northeast Bird Habitat Conservation Initiative. So thanks to everyone for joining us today.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Brian Hall, and my background is in plant or vegetation ecology and land conservation. And I'm a GIS person. I work at the Harvard Forest and with Highstead. And I am the person who did the technical aspects of this web map that we'll be talking about today. So thanks for coming.
Great, thanks, Sarah and Brian. I also want to mention we have Meg Shader at Cornell, who's working on the back end with tech during the webinar, and will help get things posted to a chat and also help with any technical Zoom questions you might be having during the webinar. So next slide. So first I want to orient us just quickly to the goals of this webinar. So we want to spend some time just to introduce you to the tool and showcase its layers and functions, and we'll bring it to life with short presentations by conservation professionals who are using it. And we will answer, oh, you can go back a slide. We'll answer questions and point you to the resources you'll need to equip you with exploring the tool after the webinar. A very quick logistic is to ask that you don't open the web map on your end. It might, having too many users might slow its function. So Brian will be using the map application and sharing his screen to show you the different layers and functions in just a bit. And so if you've clicked on the link, you can close it from your browser for now, and we're going to get you all of the links to the map and all of the different guides that we have available to help you use the web map after the webinar. So next slide. So just a quick poll. We're curious about your familiarity with the tool. So have you used the Northeast Bird Habitat Conservation Initiative mapping tool or data yet? And so in the chat, you can just put a number 1 if it's yes, or a number 2 if your answer is no. And this just helps us understand who's in the audience. Ooh, good, lots of 2s. Some 1s in there. Awesome. Well, for the no's, this is great. And for the yeses, but I see a lot of no's. It's a great place to be today. So again, thanks for joining us. Next slide. So I'm going to give just a brief overview of the Northeast Bird Habitat Conservation Initiative, and then turn it over to Sarah and Brian, who's going to dive into the data and the tool functions. And then again, we'll hear from our lightning presentations from conservation professionals who've been using the tool and the data. And then we'll end with your questions. So we encourage you to post questions that you have in the chat. We'll be collecting these questions and having a couple of Q&A sessions throughout the webinar today. So the Northeast Bird Habitat Conservation Initiative is a collaborative effort between Regional Conservation Partnership Network, Audubon Group's Highstead, and the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. We provide expertise and resources to enable partners to connect with bird conservation in ways that advance and expand land protection efforts, conservation partnerships, and ecological priorities at a landscape scale. Next slide. In my role at Highstead, I support what's called the Regional Conservation Partnership Network, or RCPs for short, and they're the network of these 50+ RCPs throughout the Northeast and the Mid-Atlantic. RCPs are informal yet organized and diverse networks of partners from public and private entities like land trusts, government agencies, conservation organizations, academic institutions, and others. And usually they have a host organization that acts as a fiscal agent. And some of these RCPs are actually nonprofit organizations. So RCPs work across boundaries on shared strategic conservation priorities to accomplish landscape scale conservation projects. And they often exist at a landscape level, so multi-town or multi-state, or they might be defined by watershed boundaries. And this is probably not unlike any partnerships that you might be connected with in your work, especially as it pertains to birds. So when we think about birds, we know that we need to think about them throughout their entire life cycle, which demands looking at their conservation at a landscape approach. So around 10 or 12 years ago, RCPs, these individual 50 plus individual groups, wanted to create a network. So essentially this network of networks, this RCP network, is supported at HISED, who serves as a fiscal agent and helps bring RCPs across the Northeast to share lessons with one another and what they're learning in different parts of the region. We help them fundraise together and work with regional partners such as Land Trust Alliance and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service toward common goals of protecting more land. And similar to the RCP network, the Cornell Land Trust Bird Conservation Initiative builds what are called conservation collaboratives by bringing clusters of regional or neighboring land trusts and bird conservation partners together around a common set of goals to focus conservation efforts on high priority birds in places where protection and management are most needed and can be most effective. Next slide. So around 2018, HISED and Cornell held a series of meetings to explore the value of partnering on our shared ecological priorities across the Northeast. So could multiple RCPs work toward shared ecological priorities, such as protecting birds and their habitats and managing habitats with birds in mind? We explored how the RCP network, these individual groups across the Northeast, could help advance Cornell's Land Trust initiative and help create a conservation collaborative here in the Northeast. And so over the next couple of years, we've worked to identify partners and priorities and generate ideas for actionable pilot projects and to find funding for those projects. And we've held meetings with these RCPs and Audubon groups throughout all the states in the Northeast and centered around opportunities to collaborate with one another and to align goals and to, again, find funding to pilot some projects together. And this is when we really officially launched the Northeast Bird Habitat Conservation Initiative. So next slide. So this initiative represents an opportunity for RCPs and their partners and Audubon groups at Cornell to leverage their resources to focus their on-the-ground activities in areas and ways that can contribute to long-term land protection objectives. And it's guided, our initiative is guided by these three main goals that are outlined here. We can go to the next slide. And so today we're going to share the results of a tool that this initiative designed and developed based on partner interest and feedback. I share this slide to highlight that this tool is one of many resources that we've developed together to aid partners in reaching their bird conservation and engagement effort goals throughout the Northeast. So Meg's going to put some links to these resources and you can learn more about them. She'll put those in the chat in just a minute. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sarah, who's going to give us an overview of the tool.
Thanks, Katie. So as Katie alluded to, our initiative partners expressed a need to identify lands important for breeding birds in the US, combined with other data that shows protected lands and climate resiliency. So this led to discussions about the possibility of building a simple mapping tool platform. So our team developed this interactive decision support resource, which we call this Northeast Bird Habitat Conservation Initiative mapping tool. This is via an ArcGIS online platform, And it's designed for the RCP network and land trusts and practitioners and their partners to bring birds into the picture when making conservation decisions within the Northeast. So we really want you to be able to use birds to support activities such as informing strategic land conservation and planning, habitat management plan and stewardship development, land prioritization and acquisition strategies, and also landowner and community engagement. So really linking bird conservation priorities to private land conservation goals. So this tool enables you to interact with modeled bird abundance combined with land conservation data layers to look at the highest value habitats to help increase local and regional conservation impact. So in this tool, we categorized bird data on 43 bird species into 5 distinct habitat types, which you see here on the slide. And within each habitat type, we selected target species based on their high priority status or climate vulnerability. So we consulted with Partners in Flight's Avian Conservation Assessment Database, we call this ACAD, to determine if species were on the Partners in Flight watch list or the common birds in steep decline list. We also checked to see if watch list species were further listed as tipping point species in the Road to Recovery initiative effort, and also if states were listed as species of greatest conservation need in their state wildlife action plans. We also engaged members of the eBird team and regional bird experts to review our chosen species. And then some of these target species were also considered due to their funding potential. So the species on this chart where you see an N, they're included in the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation's business planning efforts. And thus there's currently funding available annually to put acres on the ground for these priority species and habitats. So for the bird data, we decided to use eBird, which as many of you know, it's one of the largest repositories of biodiversity data in the world. So it started in 2002. It's seen an exponential increase in the number of checklists submitted, with now over 1.6 billion bird observations from every country in the world, with almost 950,000 people having submitted 117 million checklists. So it's huge. So eBird collects what we call raw data from observations. So birders enter when, where, and how they went birding, and then they fill out a checklist of all the birds seen and heard during that outing. And so this map shows all the eBird checklist points with a wood thrush detected in eBird in this area around the Kent Land Trust in Connecticut. So the call out box here shows all the checklists submitted that included the wood thrush for the Kent Land Trust Iron Mount Preserve. And it looks here like Connie Manes was very busy during the 2022 and 23 breeding season, since she has all the checklists here. So then if you zoom out, this map shows a dynamic range map in the Northeast with a darker color showing a higher frequency of checklists, including the wood thrush in a selected date range. So this here is May through July in 2023. So these maps are updated in real time as checklists are entered. And so you can see here, what I want to show really is just that there's a huge amount of raw eBird data. So with this vast amount of data from checklists, the eBird science team is then able to combine it with high resolution satellite imagery from NASA and NOAA and USGS into dynamic distribution models that show the abundance distribution, predicting when, where, and what numbers of over 1,000 species occur every week of the year at very fine scale of spatial resolution. So there are, of course, some challenges here. First, there's the ecological process that links birds to particular locations at certain times of the year. And then there is the observation process, or the process by which the eBird checklists are collected. So we collect many effort variables and use a series of spatial and temporal filtering to help quiet the noise in the observation process in this eBird raw data. And thus not all checklist data is able to be used for the modeling process. So there are conditions that the checklist data must meet to be included. such as a complete checklist, meaning all bird species detected and identified or recorded, checklists that use the traveling or stationary protocols, not incidental sightings, checklists that contain information on start time, duration, protocol, number of observers, and distance traveled. And then also checklists with actual counts of species, not just species that were marked as present. So eBird model data enables the Cornell Labs eBird science team to produce amazing data visualizations, such as this relative abundance animation. This is showing the changing distribution of the wood thrush over the course of the year, with dark purple representing a higher relative abundance. And this modeled eBird abundance data is what we use in our mapping tool, as we realize that not all conservationists and practitioners really have the capacity to use the program R to download eBird science data, or the ability to manipulate modeled eBird abundance data for individual species or cross habitat types for their work. So we wanted to make this modeled bird data more accessible for everyone to use via a simple and free online platform. Okay, so now I'm going to transition to Brian, who's going to take a deeper dive into the tool itself and the data, including the 4 bird layers that can be visualized or downloaded from this platform. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Thanks, Sarah.
Let Brian
So
take
for the
over.
next like 15 to 20 minutes, I'm going to give a sort of a brief overview of the web mapping tool and the data. So I'm going to start off with just giving you a sort of like a background of how to actually navigate around the tool, how to turn things on and off, how to do transparencies and things like that. And then I'll go a little deeper into our data that we that Sarah just mentioned, that how we manipulated the eBird data, created our own layers, what they're useful for. Then we'll look at some call them auxiliary or supporting data layers that other organizations have made that you would probably find useful. And then we'll do a little sort of a little story, a little scenario of how the data sets can all be combined in the mapper to look at my part of the world, the North Quabbin region of Massachusetts. And throughout this, I will be talking about giving you some little like subtle hints and tricks to make things work better, and how to get around some of the frustrating wonkiness that happens sometimes with this type of platform. So I'm going to turn off my video to save bandwidth. Oh, I got to share my screen. Okay, what's going on here? There we go. Okay. And so I assume you're all seeing that, and turn that away. And so when you first turn the tool on, this splash screen comes up with some important, legal information, funding sources, and useful links that largely what Sarah and Katie were talking about this morning. So I'm just going to close that out right now. And this is sort of what comes up when you're on a desktop. This whole tool is designed to be scalable between cell phones, tablets, laptops, and desktops. I suggest use it on the largest screen possible because it's just a lot easier. But so when you open it up, this is what you get. Let me just enlarge some things so they're easier for you to see. Katie or Sarah, if that's not visible or legible, please let me know. And so when we open the map, we have the first thing you should see are these links up at the top. And I'm going to give just a really brief overview of everything, largely because if you click on this link, the web map guide or the story map, you get these nice, so here's the map guide, really in depth on what we did and how we did it and why we did it. There's a picture of a pixel, etc. Or the story map, which is made by one of the Highsted interns, and she just did an absolutely fabulous job, and it's just a really, really fun way to learn about the data. But the other links are ways you can request the bird data for download to use in your own GIS, which is this form. This is what Sarah was talking about, or Katie was talking about, Healthy Bird Initiative. And there's a bird guide, which some people put together, Cornell interns put together, which really goes into the well, first of all, it has really nice photographs of all the birds, makes it more personal, and also great information about their biology. You can click to hear their songs, and then some of the maps about them. So yeah, visit these links at the top. Next over in the upper left corner, we have pluses and minuses to zoom in and out of the map. Although I never use that myself, I just use my mouse has a roller wheel, which is a lot easier to use. When I want to pan or basically go around the map, I click, hold down the click, and then just drag. We're going to just sort of zoom into it. I guess that's a good area right there. This button will take me back to the full extent. And if you're using your cell phone, which again I don't recommend, and you're out in the field, this crosshairs will sort of show you where you are approximately. And just remember that this data is not survey grade, and all boundaries are really approximately, especially the protected open space layer. So I wouldn't use it for field navigation. Next in the upper right, we have various tools. This one that's opened already is called the layer list, and it's probably the one you're going to use the most. And that's how that's how you're turning layers on. So their states are turned off, counties are on, Audubon Society, important bird areas. I could turn on see what the colors mean. I can change the transparency. You can zoom in. This is probably the only one you're going to work with, which is a transparency. Make it more transparent so you can see things underneath, etc. And one of the wonkiness things is like I said earlier, this is designed to be scaled on different devices. And if you're on a small device, some of these links may not show up, and some of the tools may not show up. So I'm going to basically just zoom in a little more, zoom out on my Chrome. So now you're seeing all the tools. And if you're not seeing all the tools, you will see this. Well, actually, it went away. You'll see this tool, which is more. If I click on that, all the tools are visible. So if you're not seeing something, click over there. But I'm going to zoom out. So there's the layer list. Other tools we have are a legend, which is how you turn this on to see what the different colors mean for the layers that are turned on. We can change base maps. So there's like, I don't know, there's probably 15 or 20 in here. I really like aerial photographs, this light gray canvas, and then this topographic one. Those are the most useful, I think. We can draw. So we can just draw shapes on our map. Let's clear those. We can measure things. We can print, which is a great way to if you make a nice map of an area you're interested in, you can print it as a PDF or a shapefile. You can share a link, which will remember your zoom level and the layers you turned on and share it with a friend. And you can make like spatial bookmarks if you wanted to, like I have some of my region. Yeah, so that's how to use the tool. And I'm going to zoom out a little bit so we can see more things. So let's talk about the bird data. So Sarah showed us how the eBird scientists take the raw observation data and checklists and make that wall-to-wall and global scale modeled bird abundances. And so we basically took the abundance data and rescaled things so that all of our priority species will have equal influence on the final analysis, regardless of whether it's a very common species like a wood thrush or a less common species. And it's really important to know and remember that the eBird data is modeled or created at a rather coarse scale. So each pixel has a 1.6 mile sides to it, and it contains about 800 acres. So this sort of limits its precision for individual properties. Rather, it's intended to give sort of a landscape scale perspective for the birds. And since the data is modeled, it may be important to verify species occurrences in the field or on a property, which can be a great public engagement activity. So let's look at some of our data. The first one we'll start with is the individual bird species abundances. So if I click on this triangle, we see there's 5 different layers underneath of each of our habitat types. And we'll click on forests. So now we're seeing 2 layers for each species that occur in forests. And there's like 14 forest species in our data set. So let's turn on this Bicknell's thrush, which is this little bird. And I turned on the abundance and nothing's happening. Okay, that's because in order to see any layer, you have to turn any parent layers that it belongs to on first. So I got Bicknells, I got to turn on forest, then I got to turn on that. And we'll zoom out to the region because there's none of the North Quabbin. Turn on the state layer. So now we're seeing, what are we seeing? We're seeing a cold to hot scaling going from essentially 1 to 100. And each one of these pixel values is its percentile. So it's basically the percentage of pixels that contain this bird where it has a higher value than. So for example, this hottest red is 91 to 100, which means that if it's this color, it's got a higher modeled abundance of Bicknell's thrush than 99 or than 90 to 100% of the other pixels. So, something in here, means it's got a higher value than maybe half the other pixels. That's kind of complicated. So sometimes people want to just see, just show me the most important pixels for Bicknell's thrush. So we created this layer, which is the highest quality habitat, where each pixel that is purple is basically the top 30% for that bird. So it's okay. So if we turn those on and off, you can do this on your own, but believe me, it's basically just going to be these top 30%. And you may want to use that instead of using this percentiles just because it's so much easier to understand. And this 30% cutoff, it is arbitrary, but we picked that with discussion with a lot of bird experts on what was most appropriate. I'll turn those off. Now, another layer we've created is what I call the bird species list by pixel. So I'm going to turn this on, and they're actually not really pixels in this case, they're groups of pixels, but this is what the world looks like in this view. And if I click on any cell, I get this list. Is that all? Well, that's visible. But it's the list has each habitat, forest, scrub, shrub, wetlands, marsh, etc. And if that shape you just clicked contains the top 30% for that species, it's got it 1 next to it. So the cell I clicked is great for good habitat for black-billed cuckoo, eastern whippoorwill, blue-winged warbler, etc. So this is really useful for if you're interested in maybe writing a grant to protect a certain property or to do some management. You can click on this and say, this habitat is great for Bicknell's thrush, but it's also great for all these other birds. Or it's actually really useful for showing to a landowner to show them how important their property is for different species. That. We also have, so these data layers I talked about are really, from basically a species perspective. They're showing the best breeding habitat for the individual species. But let's pretend that instead of wanting to protect habitat for a single species, we want to identify locations of a particular habitat, let's say forests, that support the greatest number of priority bird species. So the habitat quality layers, unzip them, make it bigger, are constructed such that let's look at forest quality. This is going from 0 to 7. And this is basically the number of forest species that their top 30 occurs in that area. So if it's bright red, it means 7 of our high priority species have their best habitat there, all the way down to 0. We did have 14 forest priority species we looked at, but a 7 is the highest number that occurred in any one area. We'll just sort of zoom out and look at those for the region. And another important thing to remember in this, when you're using this tool, is that layers on top will cover up layers underneath it. So I've got state bounds turned on, but they're just outlines. So you can see right through them. But if we turn on coast and shoreline, the same thing, it's going from cold to hot. And, we can see those are really all in the coastal areas. We turn on wetlands, and that's basically just covering up coast and shorelines. And we're seeing where their highest values are. Grassland birds, farm country, essentially. Pennsylvania, Western New York, Delaware, Virginia. So scrub and shrub, shorter forests or young forests. and then forest birds. I have everything turned on just to show you that whatever's on top covers up whatever's underneath, but that's actually not really good practice. You probably ought to be looking at one thing at a time. Great. So that's and so this particular habitat quality is really good if you want to get an overall look at a landscape by the habitat type. And so not only does it it's just like the other layer I just showed you, where you can describe that this forest parcel is not only good for one bird, but it's also good for these other 6 birds. Yeah, so we have some supporting layers in here. We have the National Audubon Society Important Birding Areas, which shows areas that deserve additional conservation and or very careful management decisions. And they're colored based on the scale of the significance. So they're state, global, or continental. We have RCP bounds, which Katie showed you the map. We'll just zoom in a little bit. And so there's a lot of areas have more than one RCP overlapping each other. And so if I turn these layers on and click on something, this window pops up, and right away you should notice this is one of 3. So the North Quabbin Regional Landscape Partnership is one of the 3 areas I clicked on. I can right click, and there's also the Friends of Silvio Conti and Quabbin to Cardigan. And basically any layers that you have turned on, you may be able to do that, to see what's underneath. It's basically just a spot you click on a given point. We also have, I'm going to turn these things off just for our sanity's sake. Protected open space layer, or it's actually the Nature Conservancy, it's called the secured areas. And it shows those areas that are secured from development and preserved for nature and other multiple uses. And what's really important here is this data set is massive. And so I had to simplify a lot of the boundaries so that will draw on your screens in time. So it's, yeah, so don't use this for navigating out in the woods, because it's really, really simplified. It's smooth. We have the Nature Conservancy's resilient and connected networks, which when I go to see what the legend means, it's not really showing up. So let's just open up the legend tool, which is hidden. So what this is showing is resilient areas. And so climate resilience in their world, and this data set means if those areas are protected, they're diverse in their geography such that they will protect a wide variety of species under climate change. But we also have elements of flow, which looks at sort of regional scale movements of terrestrial plants and animals. So going north and south, east and west. So it's basically how easily can animals or plants move around. And we also have recognized biodiversity. So this is showing areas that are deemed to be important for biodiversity for whatever reason. And there's actual field data to verify that, yeah, this is really an important ecosystem where a rare species lives here. So yeah, let's just look at a quick scenario on how to use this tool. I'm going to, first I want to upload. You can add data. So I'm going to upload a file of my pretend RCP. And it's a zipped file, a shape file I made in my GIS layer, and there it is. Turn some of this other stuff off. And let's look at, let's just look at habitat quality for forest birds. So again, this is the number of species that have their top 30 habitat in that pixel. I know for a fact that this area doesn't have a whole lot of no coastal birds, very few wetland birds, not a lot of grassland birds. It's really it's strong for its forest birds and scrub shrub birds. So we'll stick with that one. If I turn on, so we're seeing the red areas are the areas that are most important for the most number of birds. I want to know how well protected are those areas. So I'm going to turn on a protected open space. And we're seeing it's in the brown. It's kind of hard to see that because they're kind of transparent. I'm going to just make those more opaque. So now the red areas that we're seeing that are not covered in brown, I'm going to turn off my pretend RCP, such as here and over here, are important for the birds, but they're not currently protected. I want to just make a little map to share with a friend. I'm going to draw some circles, the black line. So yeah, that's important. Actually, this one. Now it's, oh, hold on a second, clear. So we're going to look at those areas. Let's look at some other data. So not protected, but important. How good is it for climate resilience? So I'm seeing some blue things, which I remember are they're important for, they have climate resilience and they also are important for flow. So there's enough habitat or diversity here so that a wide variety of species can live here, not just birds, but plants and animals. And it's important for flow, that is for regional movement. So those are, yeah, that's looking really important. This one a little less so. We can look at Audubon Society importing birding areas. We'll turn off some things. I'm going to turn off so you can see that. So here's an important area, and here's another important area. And so I could print the map out to a PDF. I could just, in my preferred way, is just take a screen grab. Yeah, just take a screenshot, and I can email that to a friend, etc. Yeah, so that's just a brief overview. And remember those guides are on there to make everything a little more clear, and you can peruse it at your own time.
Thanks, Brian. Thanks, Sarah. That was great. And I feel like every time we go through this, I always learn something new myself, even though I was part of the team.
Me too.
And so for many of those, if this is the first time kind of getting any of this information, fear not. There's a lot of great resources that, again, that Brian pointed out that is embedded in the map. If you're like, wait, where's that guide or where's that story map? Kind of really explained it. It's going to all be linked. It is all linked there. The story map might not be yet, but so we have a couple questions that came in. If you have any questions that came up, throw them in the chat. We had a couple come in while you both were presenting, which we're going to look at now. And so the first one might be, I think, for you, Sarah, but from Nancy, could you clarify which funding source is the one that currently has funding for those extra species marked with N? Was that NIFWIF? Which specific funding source? That's one question.
Sure. Hi, Nancy. It's National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, and they have many different tracks, funding tracks. So the one, I believe that there's, I think, a couple that would cover this area. It's New England Rivers and Forests and Rivers Fund, I believe, is the biggie. They changed their name a little bit, so they tweaked it a little bit. So I'm not sure if I have the exact right name. And then I believe there's another one that's that covers also some more of the Appalachian region, like into Virginia. And I will look that up and let you know which one that is. I can't remember the name of that one right now, but I know there's a really good on the NIFWIF page. There's a really good explanation of all of their funding tracks in the region in which is what it includes. So I would look that up.
Yeah, and I'll add that when we were looking at our list of priority species and Sarah went over how we chose those, we did cross-check knowing some of what NIFWIF also identifies as a priority species for funding. So they do outline that with the different grants that they offer, which particular species is a target for those different grants in NIFWIF.
Right, and I should also say Working Lands for Wildlife funds under the Farm Belt also in EQIP and Working Land for Wildlife, that includes golden winged warbler, some of these other birds. So there are other funding sources out there as well.
There was another question that came in from Zach. Might be for you, Brian, but what do you think is the ideal scale to use this data or tool?
Yes, that's Zach. That's a really great question. And unfortunately, there's no, with this conservation data and pretty much all conservation data, regional conservation data? That's an important question. I think that it's important to, well, first of all, to sort of verify the occurrence of some species on a, say, on a property, or the potential for it. So if you look at the map guide, you'll see, I made a figure where it's got 1 pixel, and you can see the aerial photograph underneath it, and you're seeing that it's scientifically it's a landscape. It's an area of patches of forest, farmland, built up areas, wetlands, ponds, etc. So it's a landscape of different ecosystems. And so it's important to, if you're looking at a particular property, which I would do you could do with caution and humility. Make sure you're talking about the right ecosystem for that particular, the right habitat for that particular species. But yeah, it's not an easy answer.
Yeah, I agree with what Brian's saying, but I think it can be used at many different scales. I think that you could look at it from a landowner perspective and how their land fits into the surrounding region. All the way up to, looking at it through across the RCP network, or across, maybe I should better say across an RCP itself, right? So more of a regional perspective. That I think diving into those bird data layer definitions, so you make sure you have a good understanding of that first, through the guide and through, reviewing what Brian has taught us today, will be really helpful.
Yeah, and if you, Zach or anybody, if you feel free, if you need, want to talk to any of us later on, that's perfectly fine. Get a hold of us.
Right. There's a few questions. I'm not sure if we're going to be able to get to all of them right now, but another one that came in from Kat: does this mapping tool interface with landscape conservation software?
Kat, is that a particular program, or do you mean just in general?
Abbott, if you
Okay.
want. Yeah.
Yeah. So
I'm
not familiar with that software, but this data, if you're a high-end user of software, I would suggest requesting the data, the download, and then you can use it in whatever tool you wanted to.
I think we've got time for one more. This is eBird question. Since the data is eBird derived, is there a way to identify areas which have not been eBirded and need data?
That is a really great question. And from this, you cannot, because it's not eBird raw data. This is modeled data. So it takes into account areas that are not birded already in the models and the projections. So if you want to do that, which I think is a really good exercise, especially on private lands, is to go into eBird itself, create an account, and then you can do sort of step through what I showed you by, searching on a species or in an area and looking to see where there might be gaps.
And I'm breaking my own rule here, but it's a similar question, or similarly around eBird. What was the year range of the eBird data that populated our tool? That's another question.
I believe it was to 2021.
2021.
Yeah, it's in the map guide.
Yeah, great.
But
so
it's many years worth of data. So things didn't change too much in 2022.
Okay. Yeah, and again, that map guide is linked within the web, the mapping application that Brian just walked us through. But we're going to move on because we have 4 presenters to tell us how they're using the tool, really help bring it to life for you. And so please reach out to us with other questions for those that didn't get answered. I know Brian or Sarah, you want to address them in the chat. Meg can also put our contact information in the chat, and you can reach out, and we'll definitely follow up with you either during the chat or right after the webinar. So we're gonna transition to hear from our panel, our presenters, about how they're using the tool, and Sarah is going to kick us off and introduce our presenters.
Great. So next, this is our panel that you see here on this slide. And our first speaker today is going to be Bethany Bookout, who is the youth coordinator and Grayson Davey, who is the conservation coordinator for the New River Land Trust in Virginia. And they will be sharing their experiences expanding the land trust capacity for bird conservation through exploring the mapping tool with a grant that they received from the Cornell Land Trust Grant Program. Okay, so Bethany and Grayson, take it away.
Great, thank you so much. We're going to start sharing our screen. Up. Okay. Great. Can you all see that? Okay, good morning, everybody. So I'm Bethany.
Hi, everyone. I'm Grayson.
And excuse us for any noise disturbance. We have unexpected roofing construction today. Hooray! So bear with us, but it's going to be a quick talk, so hopefully we won't have anything too disturbing happen during this seminar. Yeah, so we'll go ahead and start talking about the use of this tool, this really fantastic tool. Go ahead.
Okay, so I'll talk a little bit about the land trust and how we found this tool and how we are using it. So our land trust is down in Southwest Virginia. It's the New River Valley is our service area. It's a area down in Southwest Virginia. Some of y'all might be familiar with it. It is technically, I guess, part of the Northeast, but it's really more in the Mid-Atlantic. And we have a lot of projects that we do. We do all sorts of land conservation projects, easements, public access, stuff like that. But one of the things we really try and rely on is using hard data to inform our conservation projects and where we want to focus, what we can tell landowners, how we can present the land in the best way we can to get grants, make sure we're not missing species that might be there. And we have a lot of great data to do that. A lot of our data is, so like this is the Roanoke log perch, which is a federally endangered species. We have a lot of great hard data on where this species is, fish passage data on where this species can and cannot get through. And we also have a lot of other data just on habitat for a lot of species. But one thing we realized was there's a huge hole in our data, and that is birds. The Virginia, at least the state, doesn't really have like a good birding data set that conservationists can use. So we're like, okay, we have all this great data informing our conservation, informing rare species, but none of it is really birds. And so there's just this huge hole. And so we started looking around trying to figure out how can we plug this hole? We know that there are lots of birds in this region. We know that there are rare birds in this region. How can we find data to support that? And that's when we found the Northeast Bird Habitat Conservation Initiative mapping tool and the eBird data. And we were like, wow, this is really interesting. There's all this data that people have compiled for us. Now, how can we use it? How can we utilize it to inform our conservation?
Yeah, so historically, right, we have been around for a while now, almost 20 years, or over 20 years now. So we've had landowners that have put conservation easements on their properties, and they have been asking us, okay, now we have the conservation easement, how do we do more? And part of that work that we've been doing now, as well as continuing our easement work, is right, doing these restoration projects, habitat restoration. And because of the data that we have been prioritizing, and also local programs and statewide programs, we have been prioritizing aquatic habitat because we know we have endangered species in our area for aquatic habitats. Excuse me, roofing. Yeah, so we've been fencing cattle out of streams, like helping landowners do that on their properties on working farms, and also doing stream restoration work. But we want to do more. We have local landowners that would like to put bobwhite quail on their property and have already started reintroducing these species. And we also know from landowners that there are grasshopper sparrows here and other declining bird species. So we applied for a grant for the Cornell Small Land Trust Small Grant Program, and we got it. And we are having 3 different approaches to start building our capacity for doing bird conservation work. So we're going to monitor, we've been monitoring 2 working farms for grassland bird species with eBird and teaching how to eBird, but a lot of our volunteers already know how to use eBird and are expert birders helping us with this. So we're kind of looking on the ground, what birds are around here. And then we also want to build our GIS capabilities, integrating this data, using the Northeast bird habitat data, and really start integrating that into our already process of using data for conservation programs. And we're also developing landowner tools and landowner materials so that they can know how they can do more with their conservation easement. And to inform us on that, we've also been conducting landowner interviews to let us know, okay, what do they actually want from us? So we've been starting to use the tool and also mapping our own monitoring data, which
Yeah, so Bethany spearheaded this great project where we went out and we on these 2 properties that you see here on the screen, they're right next to each other. They're down in this valley in our service area outside of Blacksburg, Virginia. And they went out over, was it like 2-month time period?
Yeah.
Over about 2-month time period to look at birds and to see how many birds they could find on these properties, and how many different species, and specifically where they were located. If they were in, you know, an area with a lot of water or area near forests. Everywhere we looked was in grasslands, but it could have been grasslands by creeks, grasslands by roads, or grasslands surrounded by forests. So it was a little bit different types of habitat. And we got a lot of great data. We created a lot of heat maps just showing where we found these birds. And one of the ways we incorporated the eBird and the Northeast Bird Habitat Conservation Initiative data is we wanted to kind of see if it tracks, to see if what we were finding was tracking with what should kind of be there. Now, obviously, there is a scale issue. We can't directly compare because the scale of this data is for the whole Northeast, so it's really pulled out a lot, and ours was just for 2 properties. But there's still useful things we can pull out of it, so we can look at those pixels, as everything here is divided by pixels, and we can look in there and see, does it track? You know, did we find a lot of eastern meadowlarks here? Does that track with what should be there? And for the most part, it does. There are some areas where, you know, there were some holes maybe where we found a lot of a specific type of bird that the mapping system wasn't showing was supposed to be there. And I think that's just, you know, a scale thing where we're looking at things at different scales. But it's really cool to help us track what we're seeing and to see if it makes sense, like on a regional level, making sure we're not misidentifying birds. Like, okay, yeah, it does make sense that we would see a lot of these birds here, looking at this. So yeah, it was really helpful for us, and it helped us feel like the data we took was correct.
Yeah, so we're definitely still in the exploratory phase of figuring out how we want to integrate these bird conservation data sets into our system, how we want to communicate that with landowners and use that for planning future conservation work. So this is kind of just, we're comparing 2 species just for the sake of this presentation, right? So the eastern meadowlark, we have these on both properties, and on this, it seems like there should be eastern meadowlark on both of these properties, and it's pretty good, probably pretty good habitat for them. And for the grasshopper sparrow, which we know is on this one property here, and quite a few of them, although we only counted 1 during this particular monitoring session. And then here, it seems like there's a hole in the data there. And we're hoping that we can help fill those gaps on the grounds here by helping landowners know how to use eBird and helping them with that initiative. So we've got some initial takeaways from using this tool, which this webinar is actually helping a lot with.
Yeah.
We did have a little bit of like the initial challenge of, okay, so how do we actually use this tool? How do we understand like what is this data actually telling us? And then the scale of it, how do we integrate it into ours? So there was a lot of of those kind of challenges and struggles, and it's so good to know where all of those resources are in the tools now that I've had this webinar. For future use, I think we are planning on using this data to make a more robust assessment of future conservation projects for sure, especially like the pixel data, right? That tells us, you know, the species and like where is the really great habitat and maybe where some holes are. And I think that whenever we were using the mapping tool, like you were demonstrating, Brian, like drawing or being able to upload our own property shape files was super helpful. And it was really easy to do, very clean.
Yeah, and I think that is something we're excited about going forward.
Mhm.
In terms of landowners, if not every landowner will want to, maybe go out and count birds, but some of them absolutely will. And so if we can show them their property using this map and then compare it with our data too and say, hey, if you want to go out and count these birds and contribute to making this data set even better than it already is.
Yeah. And I think some of like our current uses that we want to use it for, we're likely to use this internally in the land trust to help plan those conservation projects. We are probably not going to, at this point, recommend that landowners use this tool yet, just because of our demographic. We've got a lot of older generation who might not be as computer literate. It's a little bit harder for maybe them to understand. We would want to translate that for them, just based on our demographics. I mean, some of the landowners we definitely would recommend. They're very like science oriented and really care about this. But from our landowner interviews, they just want a list of birds. And they want us to tell them where they should put their focus, where they should put their money, where to get money for these conservation initiatives. They don't really want to use this tool, at least the majority of them that we work with. They might be interested in maybe more of the eBird mapping tool, because then they could look up their favorite bird species and zoom in on that. And this might not have all of the species that they might be interested in, like an indigo bunting, for example, is one of the species that they're really excited about, or a cerulean warbler. So that's just like in its current phase, which I'm sure it's going to be, more developed, and it's already great now, but yeah. So that's kind of what our landowners want. And that's kind of a wish list item that we would love to see added, I think, is kind of a summary of, okay, what species are present here? Not just like, what are the good habitat, but if there was like a pixel that gave us like a whole list of the birds that you can find on this property. That's something landowners really want, at least here. From
Grayson and Bethany, I think we're going to move on. This is so
Great.
wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much. I
Thank
think we have
you.
a couple other speakers.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, guys. That was really, really helpful and insightful to sort of learn how you're using it in your as you're starting to go about this process. So, so our next speaker is Matt Morris, and he is the Conservation Easement Steward for the Lakes Region Conservation Trust in New Hampshire. And he will share with us about using the mapping tool when considering land acquisition projects. So take it away, Matt.
Awesome, thank you. I want to introduce you to LRCT. We are a regional land trust based in central New Hampshire. And one way that I've used this tool is using it as one of many tools when considering potential land acquisition projects. Our land acquisition is partially guided by a volunteer committee, And I use a variety of maps and spatial data to help them evaluate prospective land projects, and this now being one of them. And so I wanted to show an example of one of our already conserved properties with a number of the other mapping tools that we use. And so here is our Mill Brook Preserve in Tamworth and Falmouth, New Hampshire. It's entirely forested. There's a brook running west to east through it as well. This is another mapping tool that we use. This ranks wildlife habitat. It was developed by New Hampshire Fish and Game. You can see on this property that overall it ranks very high in habitat by having mostly pink and green. One other tool that we use is one that is also featured on the Cornell mapping tool is this TNC, Climate Change, Resiliency, and Flow. And so we see that the Millbrook Preserve, portions of it have recognized biodiversity, resilience, and flow. One other mapping tool that we use is soils from NRCS. This one is looking through the lens of farm soils, and so we see here at Millbrook Preserve, it's not super important for farm soils, but there may be other properties that we look at that have prime farmland. And so now moving on to the this mapping tool. And so as we discussed, the scale of it is not super useful at the parcel level. But so with this tool, I don't produce maps for our volunteer committee. However, I do take this data and just share what data I extract from them. And so looking at here, we're looking at that species list. And so we see at this parcel, the top 30% of habitat quality is applicable to, I think, five forest bird species and one young forest species. And then here's just also looking at that of just general quality habitat by different habitat type. And so this here is looking at forest habitat. And so we see that it's kind of in the higher end with being high quality habitat for 5 forest birds in that northern section. A potential other uses of this tool that we've not used but may in the future is kind of looking at it in terms of future habitat management. And so here I'm taking you to another one of our conservation areas. This is the polygreen forest. The species list of this mapping tool identified 3 focal species as having high quality habitat here. One of them being the chestnut-sided warbler. And so using this tool, we may decide to manage this property in the future for chestnut-sided warbler and other kind of young forest pocket species by doing a number of small patch cuts to kind of enhance this property for chestnut-sided warbler and other species that use similar habitats. And through these mini presentations, we were asked to answer a number of questions. So one of them is, how are you using this mapping tool in your work? And so just to summarize, I've been using this tool as just one of many tools to evaluate prospective land acquisition projects. I've used this data by downloading it from the website and then kind of inputting it into our own ArcMap software. Second question was, what information were you trying to gather with the tool? And so the information I was trying to gather was just the presence of any high quality habitat or the presence of any of the focal species. And lastly, what did you learn? What was the outcome? We were really just looking for more context and more information about any particular property that we're looking to conserve. More information is always good and helpful. I'd also want to note that this mapping tool has never been the make or break deciding factor whether each LRCT pursues conserving a particular property. It's just one of the many tools that we use. And then there may be potential uses for this tool in the future in terms of habitat management and grant applications. And that's all I got.
Super. Thank you so much, Matt. That's really, really helpful to hear and see visually. Great to hear that it's one of the many tools that you're using to support your work. Okay, so our next speaker will be Jerry Tuval, and he's the Vice President of the Board of Directors for the Audubon Society of Northern Virginia. They are using the tool to identify areas of high quality habitat for priority species they've identified in Northern Virginia, so they can work with parks and surrounding neighborhoods to enhance existing habitat and create new habitat for those birds. Okay, take it away, Jerry.
Thanks a lot, Sarah. And I'll preface this by saying I'm not a spatial analyst and I'm not a GIS specialist. I know ArcGIS just enough that I can do basic maps, unsophisticated maps. So that's what I'm going to share with you this morning. And there were some questions before, and Matt touched on it as well, whether the data were available for download. And I am running this live on my own laptop with downloaded data. So I haven't used the online tool, but this is all running off ArcGIS. It's installed on my laptop. So with the Audubon Society of Northern Virginia, we have an initiative that we call Stretch Our Parks, where we're working with parks around the Northern Virginia area to enhance existing bird habitat and create new bird-friendly habitat within those parks. And perhaps even more importantly, as Sarah was saying, we're working with the surrounding property owners. They could be private homeowners, they can be homeowners associations, property managers, faith-based organizations, and others to expand bird habitat, stretch bird habitat, if you will, beyond the boundaries of the park into the local neighborhoods to create more bird habitat and to create corridors in the Northern Virginia area. And we have another program with Northern Virginia Audubon called Audubon at Home that's been very popular with people in Northern Virginia, where we have specialists who go to these private properties and help the property owners identify and eradicate invasive species, plant Virginia natives, create good bird habitat on the properties, and eventually certify those properties as bird sanctuaries. And one other thing is we've identified several focal species from different habitat types, from forests, from grasslands, from wetlands, that we want to focus our work on as we're expanding the Stretch Our Parks work across Northern Virginia. So what you see here, the black outline, is our service area. So if you're familiar with the Northern Virginia region, we've got Loudoun County. Hopefully you can see my pointer. Loudoun County here. This is Fairfax County. This is Prince William County. And we have independent cities such as Arlington, Alexandria, Falls Church, Fairfax City, and Manassas City that are also located within our service area. And the purple polygons that you're seeing, it's been mentioned several times already, is the data layer called from the mapping tool that's called highest quality habitat. And that highest quality habitat, I think it was demonstrated, can be broken down by individual species. So one of our focal species is wood thrush, and this is showing the highest quality habitat in the region for wood thrush. And so since I'm running this on my laptop, I downloaded several data sets that I thought could help point us to potential expansion areas for Stretch Our Park. So the first one, I'm sure many of you are familiar with, is WDPA, the World Database of Protected Areas, which is publicly available from IUCN. The second one is Conserved Lands by Gap Status. This is a publicly available data set from my former employer, the Nature Conservancy, and hopefully it'll come on here. Of course, doing it live, it doesn't come on, but you can trust me, it's there. And then finally, what we also have is maps of the Audubon at home properties that have been certified as wildlife sanctuaries. So we put that on, we can see where we've worked with property owners across Northern Virginia. But I'll take that off for a second and I'll focus on one specific area, which is going to be right here. Let me see if I can zoom in a little on that. There we go. So when we look at this area here, come on, show up there. Sorry about this. Well, you can trust me, if you will, that there are several protected areas there. Right in here would be, so we're looking here at wood thrush highest quality habitat. Here it comes. And right in here, we would have, this is where I'm showing this because this is where I'm sitting right now. We have Great Falls National Park and Riverbend County Park here. So these are not areas where we're working right now. This is for demo purposes, but we can see that these are two potential parks that are located in high quality habitat for wood thrush. And if we wanted to look where we might have nearby allies, we can see that we do have several Audubon at home properties that we might be able to call on to help us build allies and reach out to properties close to these protected areas and expand the bird-friendly habitat in those parks. So we're looking at this as I mentioned, as a tool for expanding this project into the future. This will help guide us to which protected areas, which parks we want to work with in the Northern Virginia region. And, you know, as Matt was saying as well, these won't be our only criteria. There'll be other things we'll be looking at, which would be, you know, where can we work with underserved communities? Where do we have existing relationships with those protected areas with park managers, with county officials and such. So we're looking at this as a very useful tool to help guide us as we continue our work on Stretch Our Parks into the future. And with that, I will turn it back to you, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Jerry. That was really fascinating and a great example of walking through potential tool use, or I should say data layer use from the tool. So thank you. That was really helpful. Okay, our next and final speaker is going to be Connie Menes, and she is the Executive Director for the Kent Land Trust in Connecticut, as well as the coordinator of the Litchfield Hills Greenprint Collaborative. So she will share with us the different ways she has used the mapping tool in her collaborative work with partners, as well as within her community.
Thanks, Sarah. All right, so I'm loading up my slides. The unenviable position of going last, huh? So I'm going to speak really quickly, and luckily the examples that I hope to share with you today are examples that are going to resonate because they have been spoken about by my co-panelists. So as Sarah was saying, I do coordinate the Litchfield Hills Greenprint Collaborative, which is a regional conservation partnership in Northwest Connecticut, part of the RCP network. We are about 33 conservation partners that work together, including many single town land trusts, a few regional land trusts, and one or two statewide, and a lot of all volunteer land trusts as well. So the RCP format gives us a way of sharing our strengths and leveraging the power of our work. We're really lucky. We're fortunate in the Greenprint to have like very, very powerful GIS with many useful layers that are, pretty reliable, almost the most current GIS data that you could imagine getting, including, an open space layer that is better than anything else. Farm soils, wetlands, aquifers, all of the layers that you would hope to have, and to have staff support. So if I can find how to advance my slides, sometimes it's hiding at the bottom. Different ways that I'm using the mapping tool. There are 4 different areas. I'm going to spend about a minute on each. So the Litchfield Hills Greenprint Collaborative participates in a 4-state landscape scale conservation initiative called Follow the Forest. And Follow the Forest, aligns with TNC's data on staying connected and flow that was mentioned earlier in this presentation. And actually there's, a whole another mapping tool that Follow the Forest uses to analyze where our areas of core forest are, where they might need to be further protected, and how they connect to one another, basically with a goal of protecting at least 50% of all forest cores, 250 acres or greater, and maintaining at least one viable connection between each of those cores so that we don't create species islands. We've been able, through this initiative, to create a lookbook of about 200 or so parcels that are in the Greenprint area alone. That would form our conservation strategy for that area. If you're interested in learning more about Follow the Forest, there's an extensive story map and this interactive web map that's available online. So unlike others who have said, the pixel data is not fine enough, so it's not terribly useful, I do find it really useful in working with Follow the Forest because it really brings this down to scale. So one of the things that's so powerful about Follow the Forest is that it can be applied at a really macro level or like the most micro level, like you're looking at a street crossing. So here, in terms of how we prioritize properties for protection, you can see an example in the top here of a parcel that might be protected, and what this does in terms of its ability to shore up this particular forest core and to make viable connections between the forest cores. But as I looked into the mapping tool, I was able also to see that there are 7 different bird species that might be using this area. To me, it's not a far cry to extrapolate what other terrestrial species might be co-aligned with those bird species. And so the mapping tool, to me, informs the additional things that you might want to have in order to raise funding around properties that you are seeking to preserve, or just generally to help people learn about what it is that you're hoping to protect. All right, so we also are using the bird mapping tool in our stewardship planning. And so in my role as the executive director of the Kent Land Trust, I was lucky to receive a grant through Cornell Lab to do some stewardship work in a statewide important bird area called the Macedonia Forest Block. And this forest block spans 2 towns. It includes protected lands that are owned by maybe 7 or so conservation partners. And our grant brings these partners together to think about how to have a management strategy that works for the entire thing, as opposed to parcel by parcel. So the partners are meeting about the management needs and our response to that. I find the mapping tool is helpful because we're all looking at the same thing. This particular IBA calls attention to 2 forest species, including the cerulean warbler and the wood thrush. I obviously like the wood thrush, but this is in a different area from what Sarah showed you before. If you look at the eBird raw data, you might be able to see some abundance data about the cerulean warbler that is centered around this area. But actually, as I dug a little deeper and used the mapping tool, I was able to see that while we look pretty good in terms of habitat condition and abundance levels for the wood thrush, that we have less data available, potentially signifying a need for better management for cerulean warbler. So, and then I do want to, Brian spoke about this just a little bit, but by using the mapping tool, if you're really trying to zero in on specific species and what it is they might need, I use that horizontal nav bar to access that menu about the bird species, where you could zero in on the forest habitat and what the cerulean warbler might need in terms of management. Okay, coming to a close. Like Bethany, we are also using the mapping tool for outreach. And this slide shows Marvelwood School students. The Kent Land Trust is fortunate to have on our board of directors the chair of the Marvelwood, which is a private high school, science department serving on the board. And Lori Doss works really hard to engage her students, not only in doing field work related to birds, but in bringing that field work to the larger public. So, we are really happy. And so were the Marvelwood students to find the tool as a way to kind of supplement the field work that they've done and what it allows them to say about the birds that are living in and visiting certain areas of Kent. So again, this slide is particular to that Macedonia Forest Block IBA project that I spoke about. But the interns that we're using from Marvelwood are also doing this at various spots throughout Kent. And that kind of brings me to my last slide, which is that, as powerful as bird data is for conducting outreach, one of the aligned purposes that we see in doing that kind of outreach is the need that several of us spoke about on this call for increased collection of bird data. And, obviously I'm a huge fan of eBird. I think that I've noticed other members of the public have a harder time jumping from using Merlin, which they find enriches their experience in bird watching, to actually collecting data. So by setting up eBird hotspots at each preserve and conducting the outreach to help people feel confident in using eBird, I think that we'll be able to supplement that data, which, just going back to my point about stewardship, it's a little unclear whether the data on the cerulean warbler indicates a lack of data. Maybe people are much less confident reporting the cerulean warbler, kind of an elusive bird, harder to spot, not as confident as they might be, for example, in reporting the lay of the wood thrush, which is, it's harder to make an error that way. So by encouraging people to use eBird through our outreach, I think that we'll end up with a better data set that will then inform all of these different areas that we are using the mapping tool to aid our work. So just in summary, the different ways that we're using it is to supplement our GIS and use that for strategic conservation planning in a way that kind of brings a very large-scale landscape effort down, to the micro level, and provide some ground truthing and local context for that. We use it to inform our stewardship, supplementing what we already know to help us direct decisions that are, pretty targeted at different areas in an important bird area, helping to engage our volunteers and the community and the public, which in turn encourages more use of eBird and more collection of data. I'll come off share. I don't know how quick that was, but maybe we have a minute or two.
That was great. I think Sarah's going to try to spotlight. We have a few minutes left. And it's so hard. There's so many uses for this tool, and And you all just really illustrated that. So a couple questions came in chat. Excuse me, one might have been answered already. But I'd love to open it up. I'll kick us off with the one question that did come in the chat that I don't think got answered yet. And then we're gonna wrap up. So this was from Iris, from Matt. What is the name of the mapping tool that you used, developed by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service? You mentioned a tool.
There wasn't. I don't think the one they mentioned was from U.S. Fish and Wildlife. The one they used was from New Hampshire Fish and Game. It was the Wildlife Action Plan Habitat Tier Ranking map. I think that's the one that they meant.
And there was one I think already answered about Audubon at Home, Jerry, that you had talked about, but it looks like someone answered that in the chat. It was about how many Audubon at Home properties you have and specific actions to take to get their properties qualified.
Yeah, our Audubon at Home board member who oversees that was on the call, so she's the one who answered it, so it is definitely authoritative.
Okay. I'd love to just see if there's any other questions that folks on the line have for any of our speakers. Feel free to unmute if you want, or you can raise your hand and get in a queue. Everyone is very thorough. All of our presenters. We just have another minute, and definitely want to respect people's time. Seeing anything in the chat. So I'll encourage that presenters, if you're okay, I know some of you had the closing slides. If you want to put your email or contact information, whatever is the best way to connect with you in the chat, and folks still listening in can connect with you. Sometimes for me, I don't think of a question till, hours later. And you certainly, Meg had already put our information in, the team in. So feel free to reach out to myself, Sarah, or Brian if any questions come up. And again, don't hesitate to reach out to any of us if you have any questions about the tool. So I'm just going to close us out here. I want to say again, thank you for attending today. Quick PSA, I know you probably all know it's Valentine's Day. There's a reminder, there's still time to get the lovebirds in your life a Valentine. And next we will be following up with all of you. Many asked about a recording. We'll be sending out a recording of the webinar. Stay tuned for that in the next couple of weeks. And Meg's going to put a bunch of resources and links to make it really easy to find everything Brian and Sarah pointed out about the tool into the chat. And again, please don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions or suggestions for improvements for the tool. It's one tool we hope will really help and support you and the work that you do. So thank you for that. And thanks for attending, and take good care.